I just wanted to be able to save it on two separate files. Before we start, I guess, maybe let me hear what are people's thoughts or questions or things that you've never understood about the Haggadah, if there are such things, which either I'll know the answer to or I'll make sure to know the answer to by next week. I could just start talking, but I want to talk about things that you're interested in hearing, so.
It's a biblical commandment to recite, to remember the Exodus, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the reason we're obligated to do it because of the Torah says to do it, right?
Mm-hmm, correct. No, so actually that's an interesting, a very important thing, and one of the reasons why I want to do this class for the next few weeks, because, let me just find where he talks about it here. There's actually a mitzvah to remember the Exodus of Egypt every day, not just every day, but twice a day, once during the day, once during the night. And we fulfill this obligation by reciting the Shema morning and evening. And in the third paragraph of the Shema, it says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem asher hotzeicha eschem mi'etz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. So we mention it, and we mention it many more than that throughout the prayer. It's mentioned many times. But the biblical obligation to recite, to remember the Exodus from Egypt every day is fulfilled by saying the Shema morning and evening. If you look on page 398 in the third paragraph, it says, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Azariah said, I am like a man of 70 years old, yet I did not succeed in proving that the Exodus of Egypt must be mentioned at night until Ben Zoma explained it. It is said that you may remember the day the day you left Egypt all the days of your life. Now the days of your life refers to the days, and the additional word all indicates the inclusion of the nights, right? So right at the very beginning of the Haggadah, we actually make mention of the fact that there's an obligation to mention the Exodus of Egypt every day, twice a day. So what is the difference between the daily obligation of mentioning the Exodus, remembering the Exodus, and the unique obligation of Pesach evening?
Well, a lot of it's geared for the children, right? So it's more explicit, detailed. It generates questions in the children. And it's a different agenda, right? For the Haggadah.
Okay, I think you're saying two true points, but I think this. What you're saying is true, but I think it has to be split into 2 points. One is that on Pesach there is a specific preference to educating the children. Haggadah levincha. That's why we have the manishtana, and that it's supposed to be done even if there is no child per se at the seder. It's always done in a responsive way, because it's sort of in that Haggadah levincha style. But the other thing that you mentioned is that whereas every day you fulfill the obligation by a mere mentioning of the Exodus, on the night of the Seder, which in Chutz La'aretz is the 2 nights of the Seder, the mitzvah is to elaborate on the Exodus of Egypt. And the elaboration has no limit on this side, but it has a limit on this side. What I mean by that is that we say in the Haggadah, everyone who discusses the Exodus from Egypt at length is praiseworthy. And then we bring the story of the 5 sages who were there all night until their students came and told them the time has come for the reciting of the morning Shema. So at the end of it, there's no limit. You could expound the Exodus of Egypt the whole night, right? And you're still in fulfillment of this mitzvah. But there is a minimum requirement to fulfill the mitzvah. Now, the minimum requirement to fulfill the mitzvah is to take certain verses from the Torah which talk about the Exodus and analyze them, which is what the Haggadah does. Now, because nowadays most people are not so familiar with the text of the Torah, like people used to be, like, kids were 5 years old, they started learning Torah, they knew the whole Torah very clearly, and that would have been obvious to them when you're reading through the Haggadah, whether it's in Hebrew or in English, right? But to most of us today, it's not so obvious, and you have to, the point that I'm trying to make is that in order to properly fulfill the obligation of Pesach, one has to actually understand what the Haggadah is saying. One has to understand what each paragraph is accomplishing. So it's very nice, and I don't mean this sarcastically in any way, it is really very nice and meaningful and important that we sit by the Seder for a long time, as long as we're able to in a meaningful way, and discuss and find personal messages in our life today, and which is very much the style. If any of you come to the Beis Menachem Seder, that's very much the style of the Seder here, where it's find something meaningful, close your eyes for a minute, think about it, right? That is all very important and very much within the spirit of the mitzvah. But there is the letter of the law, which is before that, which is to make sure you're understanding the translation of the words and the connection between one paragraph and the next and where we're going with all of this, which is obviously you can't do that in one evening with such a big crowd. That's something which we have to prepare for Pesach, and that's why I think it's an important thing that in the next few weeks to try and do that. Not every paragraph of the Haggadah is indispensable, but there are the core paragraphs which are important to understand what we're doing. And maybe the way I'm saying it makes it sound complicated, but it really isn't. It's just about getting we could do it in half an hour just to show you the structure of the Haggadah and what everything is all about. Yes.
So just to clarify, this is a requirement for the adults, but the children don't need to understand it at that level?
Well, the children... that's a question which I can't answer quickly. The children have to understand... Yes. In other words, the idea is that the children have to understand as much as they're able to. So, obviously, an 11-year-old child is able to understand a lot more than a 3-year-old child. So, to the 3-year-old, you just say, God took us out of Egypt. The 11-year-old, who may be not able to get all the details, but could get more of a complete picture of the verses that we're discussing, the father has an obligation to explain to the child as much as that child is able to understand. Right? Now, that's more generic. In exact specifics and at what stage you fulfill your obligation to your children, that's a bit beyond the scope for right now.
Doesn't also depend on, read the Haggadah in Hebrew, but majority of the people aren't going to understand it.
Right.
So what you should be doing is saying it in English.
100%. Absolutely.
So it doesn't matter which way you say it. I mean, if someone understands
Hebrew,
it does matter. Say it in Hebrew.
Right.
But if not, then you should say it in English.
If somebody understands English and doesn't understand Hebrew, they arguably do not fulfill their obligation by reciting the Haggadah in Hebrew. Right? Whereas regular prayer throughout the year, so there's sort of pros and cons of saying it in a language you understand versus saying it in Hebrew. The Haggadah is very important, at least those sections of the Haggadah which are indispensable. Again, we'll talk about it more. It's vital that they are said in English. I actually have somewhere, I don't even have my phone in me, I have somewhere a list of sort of what those sections are. But I mean, the list is in Shulchan Aruch also, I just have it sort of broken down. But absolutely, one should recite the Haggadah. I mean, there's some parts of the Haggadah which are like the brachas, like Kiddush and those type of things. But the part of the Haggadah which is the expounding or exposition of the verses that relate to the Exodus should be recited in English if that's the language you understand. Absolutely.
I mean, otherwise, if you have kids, they're going to be bored.
100%. Absolutely.
They're out of the room or whatever, running around.
Absolutely. It should be said in English. Yes, definitely. In fact, the first paragraph of the Haggadah, which is not in here because we don't say it on Shabbos, but it's said in the Seder, is Halach Ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction, which is not said in Hebrew, it's said in Aramaic. And the reason why it's said in Aramaic is because they wanted everybody to understand it. And that was the common language. So if anything, today we should be saying it in English, right? And the Rebbe points out in his commentary on the Haggadah that the fact that the rest of the Haggadah is in Hebrew is not because it's less important to understand that, it's because the rest of the Haggadah was compiled at a time when people's language was Hebrew. The Halach Ma'anya is a later edition which was compiled at a time when people's language was Aramaic.
So why isn't the Haggadah written for, let's say, for different crowds? Younger kids. It should be,
Well, there are
easier.
Haggadahs have become a collector's item. Like people collect stamps and coins. There are people who collect Haggadahs. We have a family friend in England who, my father has a tradition for, I don't know, probably 20 years or so, that every year before Pesach, he gives him a gift of 1, 2, or 3 new Haggadahs. And this person literally has hundreds of Haggadahs.
Really?
And there are today, we here in Beis Menachem got new Haggadahs last year. Scott Pritikin donated them. But there are dozens, hundreds and dozens of Haggadahs for all ages and styles, and you can find Haggadahs. Just the simple translation of the Haggadah is not going to sort of really teach it to you. I think it's become very obvious in this class that just having a translation without really studying it is the translation is good. Once you've studied it, the translation can sort of bring back could make sense. But just reading the translation in and of itself is usually not very meaningful, especially when it's something as sort of complicated, for want of a better word, as the Haggadah.
Because the traditional Haggadahs that have been given out forever that we grew up with, all the bookstores handed out the same ones.
Right.
We all had the same ones, same pages, everything.
Go and never even mind Rosenblum's. Go into Amazon and look how many Haggadahs there are. Last year, I gave somebody a gift, the Harry Potter Haggadah. Somebody who's very into Harry Potter. I didn't even look at it. I don't know what it says
Really,
inside.
they had one?
I bought it on Amazon. I didn't look at it. It came and I gave it to the person, and that was meaningful to them. But I probably wouldn't even understand the reference. I've never read Harry Potter, so I don't know what the reference. I wouldn't even understand the references.
What do you do with your son?
Well, my son is still too young to have any obligation as far as understanding how God is concerned. What my son does have an obligation to do is eat matzah, because that's something which he can do. So I'll make sure that sometime during the evening he has a piece of matzah that's the big enough. No, it's not very difficult. Right, exactly. But maybe he's old enough for me to tell him that the Jews went out of Egypt, which he knows already. So it's easy to tell it to him again. He knows about Paroi and he learns about him in school. And,
Cartoon.
Right. But it's a challenge. It definitely is a challenge, especially it's a challenge which specifically shluchim who during the Seder night are trying to bring as many people in to teach them, give them a Pesach experience, and it becomes a challenge between balancing that responsibility versus responsibility to your family and your children. But one of the things that one can do is to sort of prepare for Pesach ahead of time. So you learn the Haggadah ahead of time, and then it's not so difficult to do it in the night of the... if you have a smaller crowd or a more learned crowd, then you can do it at the Seder table. But if you have the crowd often the crowd by the Seder, they're not interested in sitting and schmoozing for 3 hours, they want to get to the food. Right? So it sort of depends what the nature of the crowd is.
I know, because the Seder that we've had for the past, few years, it was always done by my wife's father, and I'd read along some of it in Hebrew and English, whatever, and it was like, okay, we're getting, boring, because, and then he'd stop for a minute, ask a question, then he'd go back, and not so meaningful. But
Right.
in the last few years, we started going, okay, who knows Hebrew? They would read a Hebrew paragraph. The next person, they'll read the English paragraph. So most of us, or most of the people around, would say it in English.
Well, what I would recommend, and I don't know how many, hopefully people will sort of play ball, is to send out a memo ahead of time, this week or next week, to all whoever's going to be at the Seder, and say, Pesach's coming, everybody should prepare a paragraph with something meaningful about that paragraph. So like this, and you split it out, so Daniel will have this paragraph, you'll have this paragraph, or this, everyone has 1 or 2 paragraphs to do, and then it doesn't need to take 3 hours. You just read it very quickly in English, you share a 2-minute, And it's interesting, if they've prepared it, if it's a personal story, personal feel, if it's something interesting. I mean, most people, if things are interesting and meaningful, the difference between an hour to the food or an hour and 15 minutes to the food is not that big, you know.
Right.
But it's just reading the same thing that you hear every year again and again, and doesn't mean anything to you. So then it's like, okay, I'm hungry. So, I believe it's very important, especially for the head of the household, to prepare for the Seder. And it's very difficult there. I mean, it's very difficult. You have to really know your crowd. You have to know what's going to interest them, whatever. But if you have a situation where it is a sort of interactive and everyone participates, then instead of having everyone walk up to the Seder and say that, divide the paragraphs ahead of time and let people prepare something. If that's doable, I think that would make the Seder, even if not everyone will do it, if some people will, if whatever it is.
Yeah, but then it's hard with the kids. And there's going to be kids with us too.
Right, so the kids should also say something. This one can sing they can sing the Manashtana, and they could say
they do.
they've learned something. I'm sure all the kids have learned something in school about Pesach.
Oh, yeah.
Right, so let them come home and share something that they did in school. Or
The plagues are always fun.
Or let them create a skit and act out the 10 plagues, or act out a different part of the Exodus.
Well, so far in past years they've had from school. They make the children's Haggadah with different things.
Right. They have now. I saw in Kasher Stam. They have a cartoon called, I forget what it's called, but it's basically rewritten the whole story of the Exodus, imagining that it would happen in modern times. So there's tractors and cars and airplanes and bombs and it's like it's the same power, the same mission, same everything, but it's all with machines and technology instead of.
Was God split like Michigan or something?
No, I don't know. It was originally done in Hebrew.
To Michigan.
It was originally done in Hebrew and it's translated into English. But last year, my cousins came from Israel, and they had it, and it was very popular for the kids. And I saw they have it in Kasher Stam in English. So, if your kids are the right age for that, maybe that's a good gift to buy them for Pesach, and then you give it to them in the beginning of the Seder, and they'll be quiet. But okay, I think we'll stop here.
What about